we're going to dive straight in now to our next session, which is on the creative industries and the climate emergency. We have an incredible panel joining us for this conversation today, so I'm going to welcome them to the stage now. We have Neil Cowling, the founder of Fresh Air Production, Bernard Hay, Head of Research and Design Practice at the Design Council, Love Sagar, musician, producer and performer, Alison Tickell, founder and CEO of Julie's Bicycle, and Caris Taylor, director of Albert, is going to chair the session today. So let's give them a very warm round of applause, please. And before I hand over, just a reminder, questions on Slido, please. Over to you, Caris, and enjoy your session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Caroline, for the introduction. It's a real privilege to be invited to this session. I'm glad that we're here to discuss climate change and how our industry is absolutely fundamental to it, and to be joined by some fantastic colleagues doing brilliant work across this rightly growing space. So we've got a lot to cover, so I want to jump into questions as soon as possible. But before we dive in, given that this could be a new subject to some people in the room, I'd just like to mention 3 key points. The first is climate change is everything change. There isn't an area of interest that will not be untouched by either climate change or the efforts to tackle it. Indeed, any subject that's been discussed today, I'm sure there will be themes within it that will touch on climate change, so I hope we're not the only panel to mention it. The second is, don't feel ashamed if you don't know that much about climate change yet or sustainability. There's a very good reason that it's sort of new to a lot of people. Actually, billions of pounds and dollars have been spent on distracting and delaying this subject for the last 30 or 40 years. So we're at a social tipping point at this point, and so ask all the questions, lean into it. It's okay to be new to it. The third, I'm hoping an image will come up behind me, although we have had some issues with it. Behind me is a creative piece launched by Professor Ed Hawkins at the University of Reading in 2018. There are no words, no numbers, no graphs needed to convey what this message is sending. It's vertical coloured bars to demonstrate the temperature of the average temperature on a single year, with blue being cool and red being warm. And the graph shows the rapid heating of our planet over recent decades. We know this heating is caused by human activity, predominantly the burning of fossil fuels. So the point of just conveying this is the power of our industry, a creative piece conveying the extremity of the situation that we're in. So all of that to sort of provide a bit of context before we jump in, but now let's go. So to kick off, why are the creative industries so fundamental to tackling climate change? Why this industry as opposed to perhaps, steel making or cement creation? I mean, they're pretty carbon intensive. What role does this industry have? This is open to you all. Alison, do you want to go first?
I can kick off, and I hope I don't say the obvious, but of course, this industry has got pretty much, it is the pearl on the chain, because we have this extraordinary capacity for inventiveness, for ideas, for creativity. We also, through our creative industries, we also have the power of expressing meaning in very different ways. The climate, nature, justice crisis produces this huge emotional range that we all feel, and actually expressing that in either the language of politics or the language of economics or the language of science is very difficult. Ed's climate strike is a very good example of that, but of that much, much broader range of expressing what we feel. And of course, we have this extraordinary connection to communities, both small and large, to individuals, to gatherings, through all the content that we produce. And actually, Caris, in my view, I think one of the reasons why we are acting woefully slowly on the climate nature justice crisis, we have a huge amount of work to do. It's an incredible invitation, actually, to rethink the way that we are, is because we have not centred culture and creativity at the heart of this problem.
Bernard, what would you say is the kind of core to, can we talk a bit about emissions, actually, before we go on to storytelling? Are there areas of impact within design that you're aware?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, building on that point, I mean, design is a great example of where creative industries can and do have a huge impact on climate, on biodiversity. So to share a kind of couple stats, we estimate that around 80% of the environmental impact of a product is determined at the design stage. We also know that 40% of the UK's carbon emissions come from the built environment. So the things that are designed by our design industries, by our designers working in other parts of the economy, have huge knock-on impacts on the impact that we have on the planet. I think that there is, two things I think that, creative industries, including design, can bring. One, very much agree with Alison, that, it can help us to make sense of what kinds of climate solutions that we want to bring in, engaging citizens in that conversation. But I think also really important as well not to understate the importance that creative practice plays in technological and scientific innovation as well. So, if we're going to, for example, decarbonise transport in a town, we don't simply need electric vehicle charging points, public transport, active travel networks. We need to use design and other creative practices to engage communities to make sure that that meets the needs of that context and that place. So for me, again, I think creative industries have a huge role to play in how do we actually take some of these national climate strategies and actually deliver them on the grounds in ways that meet the needs and aspirations of people and the planet as well.
I think that's a really great point. We found that in TV as well, that the planning stage is so fundamental. If you're sort of baking in a load of carbon emissions at the start of the process, there's little you can do to undo that later, or it will cost you more. Really great point. So what are we seeing within the industry currently to organise around this and understand our impact? What current initiatives are there that perhaps people might not be aware of in the room? Either of you?
Loads. There's loads. I mean, one thing that we need to do is to surface what's happening, and I'm sure many of you here today are actively engaged in climate initiatives within your daily lives. Julie's Bicycle with the PEC, thank you, PEC. We did a report looking at creative industries readiness. Actually, very specifically, this report was around net zero in response to policy. And we found that there are at least 17 toolkits, resource banks for people. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think one of the things that we don't witness, we don't celebrate enough, is just how much people are doing, from the tiny, tiny actions, everyday actions, right through to really trying to break through some of these policy strictures that we work with, and to really raise our voice. So there is so much going on. There is not a single industry in the creative industries that is not actually taking action on climate, and we really need to witness that better.
There you go. So there's no excuse, basically. Get involved. Okay. So we were talking a bit about audiences and connecting with communities. We, as a sector, we reach such a massive variety of audiences. And I'm wondering, Sega, if I can pose this to you, do we have an obligation to raise these issues within the content of our creative work?
I think as a creative person, you've got an obligation to yourself to stay relevant. We're in a time where you've got streaming. So in terms of content, you can access anything. I can't just be the fake Scorsese, because someone can just go and see the real Scorsese with the same number of clicks. In terms of stories, if we're telling stories which have already been told before, if we're not that good at them, we can't just rinse and repeat. And I think as a creative, whether it's musician, whether you're a filmmaker, I think if we're going to add to all of this noise of streaming and content, which is everywhere, which is almost pollution in itself, because we're just being bombarded, what stories are we telling of now? So even if we're not changing things with policy and everything, at least people can look back in 10 years, 20 years and say, well, at least they tried. Or are we the most placid, creative, epoch there is? Or are we talking about what's actually happening now? And I mean, when people say, it's really interesting. So I did Seasons for Change, which Julie's Bicycle and Arts Admin ran in the lead up to COP26 to try and get marginalized voices to use art and culture into the climate justice, and saying, what way can you, and I hope I'm not getting you into trouble, but Alison wanted about 50 commissions, but only came back with 4. Luckily, I was one of the 4. And I did something around black people, the South Circular, and talking about air pollution and how it affects us. And I think with art and culture, it goes two ways. One way is if you're trying to reach people, we shouldn't be surprised. People use music all the time. There's a thing called the Coronation coming up. And what are they focusing on? The band. You know, so if they know that, they're focusing on the band. Again, when it was COVID beforehand, guess what? You need the message to go out. Quick, let's have a little room which looks nice, and let's have messages to catch people's attention. What's that? That's art and design. We know this stuff works. Governments know it works. Regimes know it works, whether it's good regimes or bad regimes. So how can we all be sitting here as the cultural sector and be like, oh, we're not sure because somebody over there said, I don't know about this. So that's why it's funny, and we should try and like be positive, bring the joy and bring the fun to it, because now what's happening in climate breakdown is happening in a way which wasn't happening in the 70s or the 60s, but they still had Woodstock. They still started Glastonbury saying, look, we want nuclear disarmament, all of these other different things. If any politician says, we don't know about this stuff, go and listen to Marvin Gaye's album from the 70s. If an R&B singer knew about that stuff and was writing about it in the 70s, then what are we doing now in 2020? So all this stuff, we should use that as a challenge and a positive challenge. And then the other thing, aside from reaching different audiences, is saying, what's the barrier for entry? So I'm doing Project Live and Breathe, which is, again, Lambeth and Southwark, which covers this sort of area. And then trying to get people of colour to express what they feel, how their society is changed, how air pollution is affecting them. And it's a thing where you can say to them, oh, go and fill in this council form, go and do all of this other stuff, where actually it might be making a song, it might be making a TikTok, it might be using all these other creative things. And in terms of technology, in terms of storytelling, there's a panel on levelling up. Why, I'm from London, and I like London, but why are we not hearing from people in Wales? Why are we not hearing from people in Newcastle, in Salford, in Glasgow, in Outer Hebrides? Technology and design has made it cheaper to make some of these things, and if we go into podcasting as well, to get these stories out there. We don't just need to hear stories just from me because I happen to live quite close to where the power is. Design has pushed it out, and we need to hear these stories. So that's the challenge, is I don't know, we shouldn't necessarily sit on our hands. We should try and create these new stories, and globally as well.
Point very well made. I think that I think is the relevance also to younger audiences who are really concerned with this subject. There's some really good data out there suggesting that there's growing climate fatalism because the content that they're seeing, the creativity, the output from the sector I work in TV, is not resonating with them. It's just sort of, it doesn't seem to be meeting their demand in some cases. So, Neil, actually, I'm going to come to you on younger audiences. As podcasting has really boomed over the last couple of years, and I think it's probably fair to say it's kept you quite busy. Yeah. That's a particularly effective medium to reach young audiences, isn't it? How's that going with?
Yeah, it was perfectly queued up, Saga. Thank you. The joy of audio for me. I'm a radio background and now podcasting focus. The joy of audio is depth and nuance, and I think so often with so many issues, obviously, but particularly with climate, things get very polarized. Even creative representations of arguments can be quite polarizing. And the beauty of what audio does is that you have half an hour of someone's 100% attention. People are listening on headphones, and they're listening for a committed amount of time. And what are the biggest podcasts around now are news and politics and tech and societal discussions. And we make podcasts for lots of brands and organizations. And one of the phrases of the target audience that we've had expressed to us is energy engaged people. And the truth is we're all energy engaged to some degree or another. It's that's no longer niche. But what is niche is understanding those topics in depth, understanding the nuances involved from all parts of a climate conversation, whether that is we work for WWF, as you say, for a young audience, bringing in influencers and people who are on the cutting edge of climate change or are suffering from climate change already, and getting their stories out there in a way that, again, for a young audience, there's an assumption very often that they want it all really snappy, they need it in a sort of slightly patronising tone. That's not true. They need it to be accessible, they need to understand the arguments that are being made, but through creativity and through thinking about the types of content that those audiences already consume and how you wrap those conversations, you can use audio in particular as a route to then engaging them in the depth and the nuance so that they fully understand a topic, don't just see it at surface level. And so if we take the work that we do for WWF, for instance, it's hosted by Kel Spellman, who's this brilliant sort of Radio 1 presenter, Blue Peter ex-presenter, who that audience love, but you also bring in David Attenborough for a conversation, or you bring in someone living in the Amazon who, again, is seeing the destruction on their doorstep. And if you're then able to have a 20-minute conversation, rather than, as I say, just skimming the surface, then that is a contribution that we as creative people can help them to tell stories in a way that they've not told them before, and help audiences to understand them in a way that they've not understood it before. And sometimes that's just two people talking at length. Some of the best podcasts around are just, two people talking with the time that's been made available to them. Or sometimes it is something much more creative. It could be a piece of audio art, sound design. It could be a full-length documentary. But lots of people are so used to talking about this topic in a polarized way that once you give them the space to explore it, it's really revelatory. And the results that we've seen with shows that we've done for WWF and the sorts of conversation it sparked are really exciting and I think unique in the range of conversations that are happening.
I've got to ask this because I'm a former National Grid employee.
Yes.
We hear a lot about the role, sort of like pitting against each other, behaviour change, it's all about behaviour change, everyone has to do their bit, versus systemic change, and we know it's probably a combination of the both. Systemic change can mean talking about the overhauling of the infrastructure,
Yeah.
pipes and wires, which is what I was doing before this role. How are you making pipes and wires sexy?
Yeah, so National Grid, you mentioned that because National Grid's a client of ours as well, and we're now on to series 2 of a show. It's called The Clean Energy Revolution, and the brief is talk about the major infrastructure projects that are taking place under National Grid's watch, and make them accessible to a young audience, and that is talking about interconnectors for half an hour in an accessible way is a creative challenge. But it's doable, and it's talking about the future is by definition exciting. People within National Grid are already mentally living in 2050 because those infrastructure projects take that long to create. National Grid has the power to revolutionise the eastern coast of Britain because the North Sea is going to be a powerhouse, and all that power has to come in through the east side. It's not just changing the way that energy is generated. It can change the whole deprived seaside towns on the east side of England. So all of that is fascinating. It's not fascinating if it's just two old white men in a studio talking about it in a very abstract way. As soon as you get out there and you explore those places, and we have a guy called Max Lamanna who's the presenter of that. He's a young, beautiful TikTok chef. So that's handy as well. And so, you use the tools that you have at your disposal to reach that audience. But again, when you hook them in and we look through the listen-through rates, yes, they're being attracted because, they like Max's recipes for shepherd's pie, but then they are being brought in to be told about cables under the sea and the revolutionisation of the North Sea. And we know that they're sticking with that for 27 minutes. That is not a conversation they would have chosen to engage in and chosen to explore. But it is interesting and it's powerful, and they understand why that's something that not just that they should know about, but they want to know about.
I think that's a great point, and you've touched on the point I think Sega was making about the intersectionality of some of this.
Completely.
But Bernard, it's we were thinking, I think we were talking a bit about sort of exposing these themes, exposing some of the information, but it's not about telling anyone how to think about it or how to live. It's about enlightening the audience, isn't it? It's sort of an enabling it.
So, I was going to add something on infrastructure, because I personally find infrastructure absolutely fascinating and quite weirdly. But, I think, again, this is an example of where we need creative industries policy around net zero to be adopted and to be very cross-cutting across departments, including to think about infrastructure. So, again, thinking about how designers are really working with waste streams, how they're taking things like coffee waste and turning that into products that they can then sell or packaging. Train stations as well, this is another bit that I'm geekily really obsessed with, how can train stations become community hubs or spaces of biodiversity or provide additional energy supplies? Again, I think for me this is where the creative industries play a key role, which is how do we harness some of these really significant assets that we have, some of these very significant assets that need huge overhaul and have huge carbon impact, but again do it in ways that involves communities in a discussion around what does this asset look and feel like? How does this intersect with our community needs, our social justice needs? What can we imagine as a kind of positive vision for this? And I think again as well, as a sector we need to be thinking about how we can tell those stories in ways that also connect with people that are managing our energy grids. How do we engage energy policymakers deciding where wind farms are going to be put, how investments are going to be put there, to then recognise that the work that we do can really help them to deliver that on the ground in effective ways.
Also, on that point, it becomes designers, you've got an issue, and then, well, I'm not telling you what design is, but anyway, design, you've got an issue, and then you've got a challenge. Because in creative industries, there's so much stupidity. So you've got a band, and then you're going and you're going to perform at a festival. 10 bands, they'll take 10 trucks of the same amplifiers. It's the same thing, and the music's not that good to justify, I need this Ampeg, this, or wherever it is. So in that sense, then you need to think and say, wait, hold on a minute, why are we lugging it from, let's say, from here to Sheffield? And then in terms of a justice societal thing, what if they had to hire the same backline thing, but then the backline is held in Sheffield? Then that means a community can then practice to become the big band with everything essential. So we decentralize these different things. So that's a design consideration. And then it's a challenge for creative people to say, look, I know you want to take your special thing you got from eBay, but you must play through this. And that's the challenge musically, to see what do we have? What do we have that's available? When you look at grime music, they didn't really have that much. It was computers, and then you can see how that flourish across the world. Sometimes creativity, you need the restrictions. And it's like, what do we then do off the back of that? And these are the challenges which we need to think about. And then in terms of creativity, again, if you're creative, I personally think, as an artist, okay, you've got to be good at something, but it's about translating things which normal people don't have time, because they're doing their day-to-day to feed their family. So it's like, okay, here's a problem over here. How can I translate that in a way which will then pique their interest, and then realize there are million other people who are feeling the same way? So Nesta and National Gallery and King's College, they commissioned me to do a thing talking about heat pumps, the National Gallery's collection, and to try and use some artistic response to get people interested. So again, when you're talking about interconnectors, that's a bit of a tricky one. But the point there is, I thought, well, I went up to them, and this is what, so if you have a production company, or you've got a museum, or you've got a gallery or something like that, challenge yourselves with the programming. So then I said to them, look, I'm not going to talk about, and to your point, I'm not going to talk about heat pumps, because that's a landlord-centric thing and a homeowner. If I'm going to speak to 18 to 35-year-old generation rent around this area, marginalized people, why don't we talk about sustainable social housing? Then you can bring them in and say, look, with social housing, then are people putting heat pumps into social housing? Then that becomes a social justice thing. So then I had a workshop for different people where they were paid to turn up and then say, look, what you're talking about, where I took in someone talking about heat pumps, I took in B Corp architects, I took Lisa Sanza talking about black squatting, and then took these ideas, then had a performance where National Gallery gave me their 3 biggest halls, and it was all black performance with 2 poets and 2 dancers in there, and then talking about how we think of home as a human right. And then if you're going to talk about the green transition to home emissions, which I don't know, about 20% or something, how can we shape that for people, whether you're a landlord, a homeowner or not? So it's not to divide. So with all of these things, you can bring people together. But that's the challenge as an artist, for me to say, black squatters, quick, how do you want to be in from this Caravaggio or whatever it is? So, but then that's the artistic challenge of the artist. And so one final point is art and everything, fashion. What is fashion? Fashion is about, I'm wearing this, so you have to wear that. So even with heat pumps, I went around the National Gallery and I said, look at all these, you're to blame, National Gallery. Look, oh, they don't hate me. No, they don't. Look at all these fireplaces in your paintings. Not many, again, because it's fashion. People don't know what a heat pump looks like. You know, people, and I made instruments out of old radiators. But anyway, but the point being is you then look at it and they said, oh, actually, I see what you're kind of saying. You know, curtains were there as a form to block the heat in. So then you look at Insulate Britain, what they're talking about, insulate our houses. That's a design issue. Try and make it sexy. Try and make it fun. Challenge yourselves. I don't know why people feel nervous or scared.
It's a human story, ultimately, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's our lived experience and how we need to move that on. Alison, I'm going to bring you in. You had something?
Well, so much to say, but I mean, I said a couple of points. One is when we talk about systems change, I think we have to start with our own, and our own is the creative and cultural system, and it is broken. We still need to, and Sega's, you've all described examples of that, and I've been in this for such a long time now, and the situation is not getting any easier. And any kind of, I'm a bit like Sega. I just think we've got to really, really focus on this as our top priority. The great thing about that, and again has been already described, is that it is totally multidimensional and it is totally intersectional. So wherever you start in this, whether it be through social justice, whether it be through design, whether it be through creative content, whether it be through light bulbs, really, you find your way here. And there are choices to be made at every single point in that. The third thing to say in Sega, I think that there is loads happening everywhere I look. We've had a long, the oldest example of its kind, which is a policy with Arts Council England, who in 2012 made environmental reporting and action, they pegged it to funding. We now find that 75% of organisations in that portfolio, and it spills over into the commercial sector, are commissioning work on climate. 60% of organisations say this is intimately connected to their well-being. 40% are looking at climate change as a social justice issue. So, you know, you've got this incredible thing going on. We're in the middle of this massive change. We are terrible witnesses. There is stuff happening everywhere, all over the country. Wales has got some fantastic work going on. They've actually got a Future Generations Act in Wales. So what does that look like? The Hebrides, because it's so exposed to climate, has got artists in residence actually docketing what's happening on the coasts of the Hebrides. It's everywhere we look, and actually what we have to do, I think, so there's a job for ourselves, which is not just to commission the work, but on your podcast, have you really focused on what is happening in the creative and cultural community? And we are weather vanes. We've been slow on this, there's no question about it, and I don't think we've been supported with policy, either national, international or local policy. It's been too hard to get people to understand that culture, creativity, climate, nature, justice are one, because it's about all our presents and our futures. And you deal with one, you deal with all. So we need to push on that one. But I also think that we have an obligation to surface what's happening under our noses, because we're in the middle of a massive, great transformation. And with all due respect to the National Grid, which I have great respect for, there is these other power cables, and that is us. And we need to turn them on and really flow with them, because they're there, and we just need to bring them into our everyday language. We need to celebrate, we need to commission, we need to focus, we need to get rid of the silos that we exist in, the sectoral silos, the thematic silos, the greenhouse gas emissions scope silos, and start to think about really understanding what's going on under our noses and become part of that mobilisation.
Brilliant.
Really quickly, just
Yeah,
very,
go for
very,
it.
yeah. I think that's the clap. I think, yeah, I'm an artist, so I'm trying to be provocative. But as what Alison said is correct, and I think it is exciting, because all of these different places and institutions have given me opportunity, have given other people opportunity, and it's going in that direction. I just say in terms of funding, again, as a cultural sector. In France, isn't it about 2.4 billion a year? In Germany, it's about, I think, 2 billion a year. Our Arts Council England is 446 million. So let's think about it. If we're trying to do art heritage and everything else, and we want the stories to be out here, let's have that debate. We can't be global Britain, and we're that far behind.
That's led us to the sort of final question I wanted to pose before I go to audience questions, which was sort of like, from you all, feel all free to jump in. I'm sure you've all got some thoughts on this. We've got a room potentially of a few policymakers here, people influencing them. What do we need from government to help us, to enable us to do our part in this transition?
I'm happy to start with a few.
Go for
I
it,
mean,
Anna.
I think also just to kind of set this in a bigger picture context as well before going into some specific policy things, it's worth noting that I think the last IPCC report said that based on current international policy, we're on track to reach around 3.2 degrees C warming by 2100. We're supposed to be aiming for 1.5 degrees C by 2050. So we're locking in major sea level rise, extreme weather events, massive stresses to our infrastructure and housing. So we really do need policy to catch up with this issue. Totally. So I think big picture, I'd say that we need to be doing a climate test on all policy that we're doing. Are we funding the right kinds of things? Are we investing in the right kinds of skills? Within the creative industries, and I think particularly thinking about design, I think two things that I would throw in that kind of relate to some of the things that have been said about before that I'd really like to see quickly. One is thinking about that R&D piece. So we've heard some great examples of how designers, practitioners are developing new innovations, new uses of technology. Currently, they are excluded from R&D tax relief, so I want to reverse that so that arts and humanities and social sciences research are involved in that subsidy. I think you could also add on an extra green incentive. So if you're doing green transition work, you get extra subsidy. The second thing for me, crucially, is skills. I think Baz mentioned earlier that we've seen a 68% decline in design and technology education, 70% actually, I think, over the last decade. That is a huge risk to our skills pipeline, which we need to look at, not only to get those numbers up, but make sure that we're giving a sustainable design education in there. And then obviously workforce retraining as well. I think around 80% of the workforce of 2030 are currently in work. How do we reskill, but also upskill designers, creatives in those sectors so that we can decarbonise our work now? So
Yeah, it's a great opportunity as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to jump in, Alison?
I'd include all of that, absolutely. It's worth knowing we did some work before COP26, which was the big climate talk before the last one. On international cultural policy, we found there was one cultural policy in the world that mapped its investment to a 1.5 degree temperature limit. One. We need to map all our cultural policy decisions to that really ultimate goal, and we're way off, and we're currently at 1.2 degrees warming, and we've got to limit it at 5. We haven't a hope of doing that unless we really massively move fast. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I think we also need to do a mapping of policy architecture outside culture. And I think, Marcus, you said this. Or perhaps I misunderstood you. Bernard, sorry. Perhaps I misunderstood you. That actually there's lots of... That when we look at policy in silos, we're missing these huge opportunities to map ourselves across to benefit from, but also benefit other policy areas. And we haven't done that. So just looking at it in isolation means that what we can't do is this vision that we're all talking about, which is really spilling out this work that we do to a greater purpose. So we really, I think we really need to do that. And I think the last thing I'd say is I would map this against, when we talk about climate, whilst there's a huge target around emissions, it is, as you said right at the beginning, Karis, it's much bigger than that. We must look at nature and our loss of biodiversity. That's actually more extreme than climate, than carbon emissions. We really do need to look at the biodiversity crisis. And
they're very highly interlinked.
Very highly interlinked, yes.
Yeah.
And we also need to understand that this is the social justice lens.
Yeah, okay. Do either of you have anything to come in on that, or can I go to audience questions?
I was just going to talk very quickly, if you don't mind, about, again, my world is audio, and the storytelling element for us all the time is about trying to tell these, challenge the people who have these stories to tell them in ways that they are accessible and interesting to people who aren't already engaged in the topic. Very easy to talk about climate change and sustainability to those who are already there. If I take an example of Audio UK, which is the body that represents the audio industry, there was a project called the Audio Content Fund, which took government money and funded audio programs to go on radio stations that otherwise wouldn't do that. Over 50% of radio listening in the UK is to commercial radio. And with all due respect, you can't reach a mass audience with a pointy-headed debate about climate change on Radio 4. You can reach a mass audience by finding ways of incentivizing those channels like Global Radio who have access to a young audience who are hungry for this information but won't find it through a kind of commercially viable route. So one of the brilliant things about the Audio Content Fund was that it enabled a station like Capital to run programming around complex topics that are presented in a commercial way, in an accessible way to a young audience. Those sorts of initiatives that allow people like us to tell stories about important things through the channels and fish where the fish are in terms of the people who are able to listen to this stuff and keen to listen to this stuff.
Just really quickly, I'd say, to echo Bernard's, education, music education, arts education has been cut. And if we're going to talk about climate anxiety, so I was in schools last week for Earth Day, getting Islington Reading for National Literacy Trust. We want young people not to feel like it's all doom and gloom and everything's bad. How can they express themselves? It might be through reading, it might be through art or something else. We need that education in there for them to express themselves, say this is the issue. And then to the point about funding as well, local radio, pirate radio, where's any of that? If as an industry you want audio people at these big things, if they can't do the training down here, then everything's decimated. How do we get these local stories of what's happening in, whether it's coastal erosion or something like that? So look at all of this and really fight for this stuff.
I think there's a lot of food for thought there, and hopefully that can sort of plant some seeds in whatever work or area, industry, sector you work in. I'm going to quickly, we've got, I think, 3 minutes, maybe less, just to try and squeeze in 1 or 2 questions. So this is going to be a bit quick fire, okay, guys? The one that I think we've also just sort of touched on slightly there, that's come in about dystopian and catastrophic storylines and narratives. How can we have more hopeful and positive narratives? I'm going to go, Alison, in a sentence.
They're there. They are there. So let's get out there and amplify them, because I've had more hope over particularly the last year, than I have in 15 years previously. They're there, and people know how to tell those stories.
Neil?
Yeah, exactly. The stories are, by definition, as I said earlier, exciting. The future is exciting. We just have to find a way of telling it that doesn't revert to the standard way of that the conversations have been had up to this point.
Bernard, positive narratives?
What Alison and Neil said, I completely agree. So many great examples there.
Sega, any
Yeah, I think loads of
Specific
people.
examples,
I think lots of people are excited to do this. So I'm working with Philharmonia Orchestra next door as their artists in residence, and they want to do. I'm writing a piece on June the 8th. We're going to have a performance, and it's about a positive action of climate, looking at climate migrants and refugees in a positive way. So lots of different big organisations, they want to do it, and in a fun, positive way.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Final one. Alison, I'm going to come to you with this, if this is okay. Given the methodology differences between different carbon calculators, both Alison and I work in the business of carbon calculators. Some are more accurate than others. How can we, the creative industries, measure impact in a robust and consistent way across us?
Okay, so I think this is work that's already happening because there's been so much activity in this field. We are beginning to understand what holds us together and what we can differentiate ourselves. It's a really good point. The one thing I would say about carbon calculators is that measure, but don't over-measure. We think that the carbon calculator too often is going to be the answer. It's not. It's a starting point, and it's from that the whole thing can open out really beautifully. But good question, and I think it's beginning to happen.
Yeah, I get that sense too. Brilliant. Well, I will wrap up there. Thank you all so much for the great contributions. I hope that was helpful to you all as the audience. I'm sure people will be kicking about a bit at the end. And as I say, if this is the first time you're sort of engaging this subject and the intersectionality between climate change and our sector and the fundamental role it plays, then please lean in, please engage with all of us and have conversations. It's fine that this is the starting point. You have to somewhere, and when it's not going anywhere, we've got to deal with this for the next 30 years or more. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Well done, Karen.
Thank you so much, Caris, Sega, Neil, Alison, and Bernard. And I think just listening to that, and I suppose in a way it goes back, oh, you can leave, you can stay. I just, my own thoughts on that. There's so much here about actually lifting the lid on what is the impact of what we're doing here. What's the impact on the climate? What's the impact on social justice? How are things actually made? How are people being rewarded for their efforts, as we said? And, it just struck me as some of that work with young people that we were talking about in the skills and education to help them alleviate some of this catastrophizing they're naturally doing is helping understand about how sort of the supply chain stuff. Yeah. But anyway, thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much.